All right, well, I don't think anyone in my household would ever think I'm half that impressive, so thanks, Jason. You really boosted my ego this morning. So I'm going to kind of set the stage. My job is to touch on the issues that the rest of the speakers are going to be getting into for the next couple of days. We're going to take a 30,000-foot cruise over the landscape of what we're looking at here, and I really like Chemular's topic, Fortify Your Future. So I think that I've tried to keep this kind of forward-looking, bringing what happened last year that it's most cogent for what's going to be unfolding this year. So if we get into it, what to watch this year kind of and beyond, you can kind of put it into three buckets: regulations, business, and operating environment. And obviously on the regulations, first and foremost is flavors, followed by products, and then the illicit trade situation, which is kind of feeding back into a lot of the regulatory pressure that we're facing on those fronts. Business side, well, it looks a little bit similar, right? Because of the regulatory pressure, you all are engaged in the business of trying to sell your products, and the best products and the most efficacious products for transitioning consumers from smoking tobacco to safer alternatives is flavors. And so that is a big concern. There's also a lot of concerns on enforcement. We'll touch a little bit on the economic environment, how to look at risk management, and also the impact on innovation. And then in the operating environment, there's been a lot of legal issues. I know we have Stacey Ehrlich coming up in a little bit, so I'm not going to get too much into that, but there's been a lot of really consequential stuff that happened this year, and we're on deck for a lot of even more consequential legal actions in the coming year. And then we'll get a little bit into politics, and then I'm going to just briefly touch on what I like to call the other recreational molecules out there. So in terms of flavors, what we basically are looking at is a landscape that is composed of pressure points from multiple areas. If you look at it, you've got everything from cigarettes to white pouches and other novel products that are facing a series of actions. One of the more complex is the state and local actions, which is the bans. 5 states, nearly 400 localities in an additional 12 states. It's a patchwork, it's a mess. Sometimes you have one locality that doesn't allow flavors, another that does. It's really difficult to keep a track, especially for those of you that are engaged in the business of trying to sell your products. We do have an FDA CTP final rule on product standards that is listed as coming out in March of 2024. And there are a lot of mitigating factors in that. Probably the biggest mitigating factor is politics. The regulation has sat at OMB for a while in the White House. Yesterday, some of you I see in the audience were at the Keller and Heckman conference, and Dr. Brian King, the director of the Center for Tobacco Products, was there. And the most that he could say about it was that we've gotten it farther than anybody else has. Which is regulator speak for it's stuck. There was a bit of a rumor that things would happen towards the end of January, in the middle of the month, that we were going to see the reg get moved. One of the reasons for that is product standards for the FDA. They have to be once they're promulgated, they take a year to become effective. So mid to late January would have been about the last point where this thing could have come into effect before the inauguration for a new administration, if there is one. That came and went, and that's really probably a telling sign on the menthol and flavored cigar ban there, but anybody that tells you that they know exactly is full of it. The CTP product, that's a little piece of advice there. The CTP product authorization on flavors, it's a de facto ban. I mean, we can argue over the semantics, but basically everything that's gotten knocked out has been flavored products and then some. But the authorization standard is very high. That continues to bedevil people that are trying to get these products through the regulatory system here. And the biggest thing is that the FDA has taken what I consider to be a de facto product standard in and of itself, which is a modification of the public health standard to get the product approved. appropriate for the protection of public health when it comes to a flavored vapor ends device means that you have to show that the benefits to smokers outweigh the risk, and FDA defines risk, youth uptake. That is the key risk that you have to counteract when it comes to flavors as far as the current thinking of the FDA is concerned. And that is an incredibly difficult standard to meet. And as we have seen, irrespective of the size and the amount of money that can be thrown at a submission from $1 million to $100 million, nobody's gotten anything through recently. On the oral and white pouch side, it's a little quiet over there. We saw recently Chuck Schumer giving Zyn probably the best publicity it's had in 10 years. So we're starting to see some of those trigger points come through, but that has been a largely quiet area. The white pouch side has avoided some of the pitfalls that vape have had in terms of a lot of the negative press about youth uptake and finding it in kids' backpacks and so on and so forth. Could it be an acceptable off-ramp in the absence of any other flavored products? That's a big question. That could be a fallback for CTP in their regulatory strategy to say, well, youth is attracted to these vape products, but you have, some of these other products that are there. That's a possibility. I think the Chuck Schumer dog and pony show really points to the fact that pressure is building on that end of it too. And then we have synthetic nicotine. And synthetic nicotine is obviously, let's just face it, we're all friends here. That got screwed. That legislation that came through created innumerable difficulties for the category and for the use of synthetic nicotine in and of itself. Most salient, I think, from a longer-term perspective, if we're looking out not just what happened to products that were on the market and had to face that absolutely unmeetable and unrealistic filing time, and FDA fully acknowledged that in the time that they had, there wasn't enough time to complete the required information for the submissions. But I also think that the way that legislation is constructed really makes synthetic nicotine a very difficult regulatory area. If you get a product knocked out, you can't come back with the same product, and there's a lot of different things in that statute that make it very difficult, which is a shame, because especially when you're talking about the strides that the ends and vape industry has made in increasing product quality, synthetic nicotine, the purity level of synthetic nicotine, the ability to control that as an additive in all of the matrices that you're putting into your e-liquids and your products is completely on a different scale than you get with tobacco-derived nicotine. And a lot of companies are actively involved in the synthetic nicotine space because of the quality issue. It's not just, hey, we thought that there was a loophole here. There's a lot of companies out there that are actively involved in that because it's a really high quality ingredient. And so the questions that arise from the treatment that synthetic nicotine got and how it moves forward, especially for vape products and submissions in smaller companies, is something to watch. If we look at products, just kind of by the numbers, and FDA, I took this from FDA's website. They didn't have the Copenhagen decision on here, so we just need to add that. But since 2021, there's been 278 PMTAs, companies with vape and ends products in market that have received marketing denial orders from CTP. That equals millions and millions of individual products. It's been 278 companies that have been MDO'd, as we say. 4 companies, Logic, Reynolds, Enjoy, and U.S. Smokeless Tobacco. I did get Copenhagen in there in the new one. Okay, good. Received marketing granted orders for non-traditional nicotine products, and this is since 2021. General Snus and some of the IQOS stuff was previous to that, but that was under a very different regime at this point. And one brand, Verve, was authorized for market with a characterizing flavor. If you guys remember, Verve was that weird little triangle plastic gummy thing. That was in a couple of test markets. If you live in the East Coast around Virginia, it was in some sheets if you had seen it. SEs, on the other hand, there's been 11 SE submissions gained for cigarettes, authorizations, 40 for cigars, 114 for pipe, 8 for roll your own, and 11 for hookah products. SE has been a much more fruitful pathway to getting products through the regulatory system. However, obviously, that is not available to ends products since there is no predicate. On the regulatory side as well, looking at MRTPs, what is it? Well, it's a risk or exposure modification order. You can make that claim on your product. If you remember going in the Wayback Machine when Swedish Match was doing this with General Snus, they had a little bit of trouble with the process. One of the reasons is because Swedish Snus was thinking with common sense, which is never a good thing when you're coming up against a government process, and they wanted to modify the health warning because it conflicted with the claim that they were seeking authorization on. That didn't work, and they ended up going to market with a marketing claim that was conflicted by one of the rotating health warnings on their product. I have failed to see any commercialization gains that have been made on achieving the MRTP. IQOS also got one, but IQOS wasn't in the market long enough before you had the trade spat with BAT that pulled IQOS off the market. But the pathway itself, I really question the efficacy of the pathway from a business point of view. I think the one case study that you have that went through, it was promising, but I also think that in the communications environment that we have, in trying to talk about nicotine and harm reduction and risk reduction, not only the constraints, but also the contrasting voices that you're hearing from public health authorities, public health bodies, different pressure groups out there, as well as, people's distrust of what companies say, especially if that company is, looked at as a tobacco company, makes the MRTP a really big question mark in my mind as an efficacious pathway to get a product through. It is, though, the only instance where a manufacturer can make a statement on risk and a product, and I think that that's important. So I think the formula for getting it right has not been found from a commercialization point of view. I think the formula for getting it right from the regulatory process point of view, really has been demonstrated, right? Lower toxicity relative to cigarettes, the general submission itself led to the NNN rule for smokeless tobacco products. IQOS, if you look at the authorization on that, they really honed in on the lower toxicity for the exposure order on that, and I think that those are things that bode well for a regulatory process point of view. But on the commercialization side, it's tough. It's a tough road to hoe. Illicit trade. On the illicit trade side, counterfeits, tax avoidance, trade in unauthorized products is engendering regulatory pressure, market distortion, and all sorts of other issues at the state, federal, and local level. It's a very complex issue, and it's a huge part of risk management for retailers and the wholesalers. And illicit trade is compounded by the fact that there is no list from CTP that tells you what products are allowed to be in the market. There's a list of products that have been given marketing granted orders. There's a list of products that have been denied. They're very, they want to make sure you find that. But the products that are still in process that can be marketed under FDA's enforcement discretion, it's a black box. And the states have stepped in here with this, and they're creating all sorts of legislation for manufacturers to certify for their products, and it's creating a really confusing landscape for retailers and wholesalers. It increases your risk quotient. When you have somebody that's coming in to sell a product into your inventory, you have to ask a lot of questions. It's a very uncertain process. And add on top of that the incentive that you have to not ask those questions, because you have a marketplace that is composed entirely on the authorized side of very basic flavored products that are really, 2 or 3 generations behind what is the cutting edge here. And you have market penetration pathways for unauthorized and just flat out illicit products that are very easy to access. You have a direct to consumer pathway, with the internet. You have a direct-to-retailer or direct-to-wholesaler pathways as well. It's very fluid, it's very easy to get product in, and the incentives, the rewards for these types of products are in many cases much higher. And that is especially true because of the landscape that we have of the authorized products that are out there. There's not enough of a functioning marketplace of authorized and compelling products out there. And it comes back, linking it back to the discussion that we just had about flavors, it comes back to flavors. Consumers that are looking to quit smoking cigarettes are oftentimes not that keen to use a product that reminds them of the thing they're trying to quit. I mean, that's something that you hear from a lot of former smokers that are looking to quit. It's kind of common sense. It's showing up now in the real world literature. It's showing up now in some of the things from the Cochrane Report. It's been showing up in Europe. It's been embraced by Public Health UK. I was talking with Tim from eSig Intel just before we went on, and we were talking about the UK market. The other day they banned disposables, but they stopped short of banning flavors. And I think that was really a win for the UK's risk and harm reduction approach because they're not deviating from that pathway, although they are cracking down on the disposable side. But that's mainly driven by the proliferation of non-compliant product that has entered into the marketplace. And when you get that non-compliant product, you also have a proliferation of sales channels that bring that non-compliant product to people who shouldn't have it, i.e. youth. These things are all linked. The solution to it, there isn't an easy solution to it, but one thing that would make it easier is if you had a more vibrant and appealing marketplace of products to adult consumers looking to switch and stay switched. And so I think we end up here in kind of an Ouroboros situation, which is the snake in a circle eating its tail. And until we can get a better marketplace for that, I think the illicit trade situation is going to be a really tough one to crack. On the economic side of it, I wanted to take a little bit of dive in here because I think it's important. U.S. cigarette volumes have been declining. Cigarette prevalence, FDA at their presentation yesterday hit adult smoking prevalence at about 11.5% of the population, which is historic low. We see as well with the prevailing economic circumstances that we have and the continued price increases from the major manufacturers, they're raising about 3 times per year now. They're extracting a lot of margin out of these products, although they are heavily price supporting on that list price in certain areas to keep volumes up. But, really what we've seen here and the 2 dips in this, I don't know, a lot of you remember back in the mid-2010s, we had that massive gas price after the spike following the 2008 economic crisis. That caused a spike in cigarette volume, and then we had another one in COVID. Prevailing economic conditions, especially inflation, are going to be a big determining factor for the economics of our business, whether you're in cigarettes or whether you're in other products. And I chose cigarettes here because cigarettes is easy to line graph, frankly. There's a lot of data on that, and it shows really strong correlations, but I would bet that this correlation really for many products is the same, with the exception probably of premium cigars and maybe some of the more modern oral products that seem to be a lot more resistant to some of these prevailing economic conditions. In terms of total nicotine users in the U.S., that are adults, we see here that combustible tobacco products represent the lion's share of product users, whereas non-combustibles are different in terms of being about less than half the total. So there's still a lot of ground to be made up for the vape and ends and modern oral and other novel products to convert these people. That represents, that's in millions, that represents 35 million people that are combustible tobacco users versus 10 million that are non-combustible tobacco users and using less risky products. There's a lot more to go, so hopefully we can make up the ground on that. And then looking at this in terms of the 18-plus population of nicotine users, again correlating to those numbers in absolute numbers, your percentages there are quite high. Right, cigarettes dominates everybody by more than half. Ends is now up to a large percentage of the population. Almost 5% of the adult population has used ends, and this is This is according to NYTS numbers, so take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But then we have closely followed that by cigars, which is all cigar categories, smokeless, and then pipe. We can't forget pipe. It is still there, and there is a consumer base for it. And then in terms of the socioeconomics, which is one of the reasons why I brought in the slide on cigarette volumes and correlated that to some major economic milestones, is that if you look at that graph very closely, you have a lot of folks that are showing economic indicators of being at the lower end of the socioeconomic tail in terms of nicotine users. Uninsured or on Medicaid is nearly 60% of the population. Those with the highest educational attainment of high school or GED, it's close to 40% of the population. The rural percentage of that is nearly 30%, and adults 25 plus is cracking up to 50%. So it's skewing the nicotine population writ large is skewing older and poorer. A lot of that is driven, of course, by the prevalence still of cigarettes in the marketplace as the primary nicotine product that they consume. But it just points to the sensitivity to wider economic forces to your average nicotine consumer, and it's something obviously that we were going to need to watch very closely in 2024 and beyond, given the prevailing economic conditions that are out there. Risk management. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. We're looking to get together a whole series with some partners on risk management this year that's going to be open and free to everyone. So I'm really excited and jazzed up about this particular subject. I think there's a lot there that needs to be covered. There's a lot of risk out there. For those of you that are running businesses, this is not news to you. And the risks are interconnected. There is limited infrastructure, both within companies and within our supply chains, to deal with this risk. And there are external factors, which are additional risk factors above and beyond that. And so what do I mean by that? Well, the structural risk factors include pressure, right? It costs you a lot of money to keep your products on the market in this regulatory regime. So when you have that kind of pressure, you don't have the resources necessarily to invest in your own company infrastructure to create the controls exactly that you would like to try to manage risk. Then you have the risk factors of the fact that you have global supply chains. You have your products that are coming in from Asia, you have your liquids that maybe are coming in from Europe, you have different components to that. That's all dependent on shipping. There is a lot of risk rising in terms of in the Straits of Taiwan, in terms of the Red Sea, in international shipping, that is making the logistic chains really something that's kind of blinking yellow to almost red at this point. We have a very, very, very charged legal environment right now. There's a lot of uncertainty there. Obviously, theft and loss is something that is a constant. Terry Gallagher, who's on our board from Smoker Friendly, told me a story about some of the stores that he has in Colorado where a guy just in the middle of the night drove his car right through the front window, went in and took all the stuff out and left. I mean, you're seeing retail theft, especially those of you in this audience that are retailers, you know very well about this. Retail theft is a huge problem, and it's a huge risk factor, and it's very difficult to control for. Taxation, there's been a lot of changes in the last couple of years on taxation. That is an area that it's becoming more patchwork. You have states that tax vape, you have states that don't. You have, and the complexity of trying to comply with those requirements is not getting simplified. It's becoming more and more difficult to manage. And then you have the increasing regulatory requirements, right? And the shifting regulatory requirements. You submit a PMTA for your product. 2 years later, FDA gets to it, and then they apply the rules now to your product when you submitted it 2 years ago, and those rules and guidance weren't required at the time. Some would say that's arbitrary and capricious. Others would say it's a changing regulatory requirement. And that's something that's going to be really, you need to make sure you got a good law firm. Let's put it that way, and there's some really good ones in this room today. On the innovation side, I'm privileged to have a perch where I cover the US stuff from one side of my organization, and then I cover global from the other. And what I'm really starting to see is a divergence on innovation in terms of companies that are looking for investment. What I mean by that is the pre-authorization, it's a focus point in the US is a focus point for innovation, and it's a focus point for how you construct and design your product and your product life cycle and your R&D cycles. You have to meet that. And that does create conditions that may be conducive to some sorts of innovation. But because of the difficulty and the fact that we're not getting anything through, I also am seeing a lot of companies that are involved with my organization that are looking outside the US. You know, there's obviously everyone's looking at the UK as a very attractive market to move product into if you don't have options for the US. But more to the point on that, you're starting to see a lot more innovation happening. You're starting to see the pace of that increase. You know, you have innovation centers that are popping up in Shenzhen, but now you're starting to see innovation centers that are established in Shenzhen rather, but now you're starting to see those centers popping up in Singapore, starting to see them pop up in Indonesia and Malaysia, and you're seeing lots of different products and lots of different R&D and lots of things happening that are not necessarily going to make it to the US, or they're not necessarily going to make it to the US as licit products. And that divergence is something that I think is going to increase over time as the regulatory process becomes more ossified. And until we can get to the point where we break through that and find a better MO with that, there is a real possibility that there's going to be a regulatory divergence. Now, there's always been classically in the tobacco industry, there always was a divergence between the US and the rest of the world. In the old days, because I came up through the cigarette industry, in the old days it was flavor, right? The US was an American blend market, most of the rest of the world was a Virginia blend market. That had a huge flavor impact. And that presents itself as well with heated tobacco. You know, the heated tobacco products were developed outside of the US. The flavor basis of that is Virginia blend. E-cigarettes as well, you know, those products when they originally came out on the market, a lot of them were mimicking that sort of taste profile or attempting to with the technology that they had at the time versus trying to replicate the American blend cigarette to move consumers over, which had, you know, higher tar neck and CO2 ceilings. So the divergence has always been there in terms of different products, different things that would work. Obviously, the other factor in the US is that you have a marketplace, especially in gas and convenience, which is largely controlled by a small number of companies. Getting visibility on the shelf, getting your product on the upper part of the planogram is difficult, whereas in Europe, it's not so much. And then you also have the vape shops, right? In the US, the vape shops are not the same as what they were, largely due to the actions in 2020 and 2021, which really decimated a lot of the products that were being sold there, whereas, you know, in Europe, you still have that vape shop model that is functioning mainly because they have products. So it's going to be something to watch in terms of where innovation goes and what innovation is. You know, one of the things that you have to think about, and as part and parcel also to risk management, is innovation in the US is also internal systems innovation. You cannot look at your product life cycle as linear anymore. You have to be looking at your product life cycle as moving different generations of your product concurrent with each other, building up on things. You know, it's one of the things that PMI has been doing. And yeah, it's easy for PMI because they got billions, right? But one of the things that they're doing with their IQOS submissions, they don't have a product in the market, but they're coming in and they're filing. They're filing for changes to keep what will eventually become the US IQOS roughly on par with the global version of it. And that's not a linear product life cycle. That is a circular product life cycle where the innovation is coming, you're filing for it, you're making different steps for it, you're looking at it in different ways as opposed to just launch the product, get approval, do R&D, launch the new version, do R&D, launch the new version, so on and so forth. It's a totally different way to look at things, and it's frankly a little bit more expensive too. But that's something that's happening, whereas globally, you don't have that. You can innovate on that linear scale, which potentially has more efficiencies, but you know, the circular scale also can be a more efficient way to operate and certainly a more dynamic way. So, you know, I don't want to be all doom and gloom on it, but innovation is really something that's going to be very interesting to watch as we move forward. I'm really excited to hear from a lot of the speakers on that we have in the next 2 days. Todd from Triton. This is, I don't know if anybody read the Triton decision, the appeal, but there was what has now become a very famous quote about the changing requirements, having FDA causing manufacturers to chase the requirements down like a flock of wild geese. So there's circuit splits that are very interesting in deciding some of these MDO legal challenges. It's going to end up at the Supreme Court. I have 2 here, and I'm going to amend that to 3. There are kind of 3 issues that you need to think about that I think are the most salient for these, and then I'll let the legal people tell me that I'm full of it and also give you actual information on it. But for me, as I'm looking at it as a non-lawyer, when I look at the blue decision, the Fontum decision, I see that, the Triton decision, and as well a number of other decisions that might be coming out there. There's potentially a logic decision that's coming out there and stuff, and I look at it in terms of, are the product standards correct? Is the public health standard being applied correctly? And also, is FDA following proper procedure? Are they really giving people an honest chance at it? And as well, the Fontum decision, I think, is the most interesting. The Triton decision was the most searing, right? Basically, what the hell are you doing? The Fontum decision was really interesting because they went back and said, well, no, FDA, you can't make these broad-based decisions. If you're doing things application by application, you have to apply your own analysis to deny something, especially a tobacco-flavored product. You have to apply that analysis. That cuts to the heart of the fatal flaw, as well as the other tactics that the FDA has been using to just knock the bulk of these submissions out. And then when you have the Triton decision as well, talking about the unfairness and the arbitrary and capricious nature of how FDA has been going about this process, you get some really interesting things that are percolating up there. This will be determined by the Supreme Court, and I hope very much that our legal friends will also talk a little bit about the Chevron doctrine and the herring case. So there's a bunch of herring fishermen, I don't know if you guys heard of this, a bunch of herring fishermen sued a part of the USDA because one of their rules says that they've got to pay to have the inspectors on the boat to make sure they're not doing anything weird. And they said, well, no, that's ridiculous. And they went through the administrative process, which is the process that you do, and they obviously got denied, and then they sued. And the Supreme Court is taking it up and looking at it from the point of view of a lot of things, but one of the most salient points of that case, which was argued just a couple of weeks ago, one of the salient points of that case is looking at the Chevron doctrine, which is an EPA case from years ago, which basically said that the courts will defer to the expertise of the agency. So it tilts the scale a little bit in favor of the agency. Some of you may have submitted amici briefs on that to the Supreme Court. There was a lot of activity in the ENDS and nicotine industry and a lot of interest in that. But basically what that means is that there's a real possibility in the coming year or so that FDA is not going to have as much of an advantage as it's had in the courts in terms of courts applying a standard which gives deference to FDA thinking as an automatic. And so that's a really interesting thing that can happen. And I'm going to be watching it very closely. Politics. So we have an election this year. That's going to inject further uncertainty. Congress is going to be useless. So if anybody was thinking about statutory change or trying to put something, forget about it. It's not going to happen this year. The effects are likely already manifesting themselves. I think the fact that the flavored cigar and menthol rule is still sitting where it has and FDA is hanging its hat on, we've gotten it farther than anybody. That really pretty much tells you all you need to know because the Biden administration just isn't going to do that in an election year, right? I have another comment here. 2016 to 2020, was an extraordinarily challenging time for the industry. I think when the Trump administration came in and had that push to deleverage and deregulate the government, there was a lot of hope in the industry, and I don't think if we look back that panned out the way we thought it would. I think first, Scott Gottlieb, and a little bit of the overreaction to the E-Valley situation, the failure to control CDC, in that, as well as, the international trade situation and a number of other issues. We got pushed down the priority ladder as well, and FDA was largely left to its own devices. And so I think that my point on this is that a potential change in administration may not bring the large gains of relief that some people may think it would, right? That's not necessarily going to be the case, where this is a new administration coming in is going to have a lot of different priorities. We may not be the highest priority on that. Obviously, I think that we will see a new FDA commissioner if we have a change in administration, and you may see a new FDA commissioner if we don't have a change in administration, frankly. But I don't think that an automatic change of administration is going to bring the relief. If you look back at what happened in the previous administration, I don't think it's going to bring the immediate or the all-encompassing relief that maybe some folks might think it would. So it's just something to watch, and also know that it injects a lot of uncertainty. And we must not forget that the best option for anyone working in the federal government is to do nothing in an election year. So just keep that in mind as well. Other issues, and I think that's my last slide. So in terms of the operating environment and the other molecules uses active ingredients and adult recreational products, it's going to continue to face an uncertain road. I think obviously the main thing I'm talking about here is cannabis, but also psilocybins and the mushrooms and the microdosing and things like that. A lot of interesting stuff happening. A lot of progress has been made in this arena, especially at the state level, especially in states that like Ohio. Like, I was kind of surprised. Ohio's gotten pretty conservative. I was really surprised that they took that approach. So there's been a lot of really positive movement on that. But when it comes to descheduling and when it comes to full-on legalization for cannabis, and then looking at for some of the other recreational molecules that are out there, Delta 8 and so on and so forth, if you're going to have kind of an overarching or omnibus approach to it. I'm skeptical of Congress being in a position to act in the next couple of years. There have been some fits and starts on that legislation. There's been a lot of optimism at some points. But I think the dynamics that we have now are telling in terms of what Congress can and cannot do. And make no mistake about it, it's going to take congressional action. It's going to take congressional action to fix the banking situation. It's going to take congressional action to fix some of the scheduling issues and so on and so forth. You have to ask yourself a question, is this Congress or any Congress in the next year or two going to be capable of marshaling the support and getting something through? Or is it going to be a situation where it's just constant triage of just trying to keep the government or parts of the government open or not? And I think the answer to that is that I would bet on the status quo for the next couple of years. I think it's going to be a very, very difficult road to get Congress to come through and legalize. I think when it does as well, it's going to be a while before the benefits of that are realized. I think the states that haven't legalized are going to come in and look at it as a taxing opportunity and say, hey, and you're going to have that fight there. Anybody that works in this space can tell you the taxing and licensing and all those regimes in there they're not ideal. And they haven't really done what they were supposed to do, which is to create an exceptionally vibrant market that can tamp down the illicit market. And there's been a lot of silliness for that in some of the approaches that have been taken. But I think it's a very long, long road to hoe. But I also find striking similarities between cannabis and some of these other recreational molecules and early vape. A lot of really big similarities. And so I also think that it is somewhat of a cautionary tale for cannabis and some of these other molecules, because what happened to vape in terms of legalization, right, with the Cetera decision when it became something that put it down the path to the tobacco product path, we ended up here. with cannabis and those other recreational molecules, is legalization just going to be the end of it, or is legalization going to be then followed by some sort of regulatory regime? Are they going to give it to, some part of the FDA? They're going to create a new agency? There's a lot of questions that come up with it. So I think you have to look at what happened with vape over the last 10, 15 years, and there are some striking parallels to what we see in the cannabis market. There's obviously huge differences. I'm not saying that they're one-for-one copies of each other at all, but I think it's something to think about and look towards in terms of one path that could happen. So